Are you ready, Turok? Retronauts presents Game Boy Works Color Episode 8. Whoops, it looks like I missed a launch title for Game Boy Color in my rush to get to Zelda. It's been kind of tricky to perfectly pin down the chronology of this platform. I've been unable to find a single document online that gives a comprehensive rundown of Game Boy Color release dates and games across all regions, so determining the order of this series has been a bit piecemeal. Turok 2 Seeds of Evil is one I missed because, 1, it was one of those rare releases to ship in Europe before it did in Japan or America, and 2, the console game it tied into, Turok 2 for Nintendo 64, didn't actually ship until 2 months later than the handheld title's debut. Turok 2 is the first of quite a few N64 tie-ins we'll see in Game Boy Works Color. In that sense, Game Boy Color was a lot like its monochrome predecessor, playing home to scaled-down conversions of console hits. Of course, that meant something completely different in 1998 than it did at our current point in Game Boy's history in Game Boy Works. We're in 1990 there, where a cutting-edge home game looked like Capcom's DuckTales, and a scaled-down conversion meant slightly smaller sprites, no color, and worse music. In 1998, well, the hottest console games the month Game Boy Color debuted were Metal Gear Solid, Half-Life, Xenogears, and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Turok 2 for N64 followed shortly after. Scaled-down versions of these immersive, cinematic, 3D action games that could run on an 8-bit handheld required significantly more compromises, as you can imagine. Turok 2 Game Boy Color is a long way from DuckTales Game Boy. That said, I was surprised to see a game published by an American studio like Acclaim hit Europe first. At least, right up until the point that I booted up the game and heard the music. Yeah, that's definitely a game made in Europe. We haven't made it to the point in NES works at which European-developed games hit en masse, but if you're familiar with the term Eurojank, you understand why the existence of Turok 2 should fill the soul with something like dread. The combination of 8-bit Japanese hardware and European development had a tendency to go horribly, terribly wrong. Something about the game formats and design techniques that created massive hits on 8-bit microcomputers just didn't translate well to NES or Game Gear. Chunky sprites, overly elaborate display fonts, meandering level design, even up to and until the mid-90s in 16-bit games like The Lion King, it was usually a formula for sadness. But Turok 2 is not bad. I'd even go so far as to say good at times, a qualified good anyway. If this game had shipped 4 years earlier to bring up the tail end of the NES library, or if it had appeared as some esoteric Brazil-exclusive Master System game, Turok 2 might even have gone down in history as one of the great B-tier 8-bit semi-classics. It's on par with something like Kickmaster, Master of Darkness, or maybe even the Japanese release of Power Blade. Now, this is no masterpiece, but it's way better than it has any right to be. If not for a handful of really annoying design flaws, it would be an easy recommendation for people on the lookout for overlooked retro gaming gems. Turok 2 is, again, a companion game to the N64 adventure by the same name. I never really spent any time with Turok 2 on N64, having been repulsed by the awful jumping sections in its predecessor to the point that I swore off the franchise altogether. So I can't really say how closely this sticks to the plot and premise of the console game. I won't get too deeply into the history of Turok here, as that's better reserved for the Turok episode of N64 Works. But thematically, it's about a Native American warrior catapulted forward in time to a grim future where sentient dinosaurs have conquered the world. A questionable premise, but it has a lengthy legacy behind it, so sure. This game does carry forward elements of the black and white interpretation of Turok, though it abandons the older game's hub-based design in favor of straightforward level progression. But in essence, it turns a first-person shooter into a side-scrolling platformer. Mostly. Generally speaking, the platformer approach was one of the only two ways developers tended to interpret the FPS genre on 2D platforms, the other being top-down shooters. To the credit of Spanish developer BitManagers, they did try to spice things up by incorporating a few novelty modes here, though these landed with varying degrees of success. The modal changes are a big part of how Turok 2 trips over itself, but at least when it falls flat on its face, it's not for lack of effort. But considering some of the iffy design choices BitManagers made, the need to shift mental gears and adapt to a new style of gameplay with zero learning curve really sucks the fun out of the experience sometimes. There's a sort of big, ambitious mentality on display here that reminds me a bit of some of the more abstract high-concept creations for Atari 2600. You kind of have to figure things out as you go along, which can leave a more negative impression of the game than it probably deserves. Consider how the game opens. You control the hero as a helpless weakling, progressing left to right through city streets being patrolled by Dino Men. You can move forward in 2 lanes and punch foes to stun them, but you don't actually know which Dino Men are going to attack until they make a beeline for you and smash into you. At first, it seems like Turok 2 is going to be an incredibly awful 8-bit wreck filled with brain-dead enemies and cheap hits in a clumsy forced perspective environment, but then you reach what appears to be the end of the first stage and acquire your hunting gear. You then transform into Turok, the dinosaur hunter, get equipped with a knife, and find yourself at a dead end. At this point, you realize that Turok 2 is not just a linear action game. Once you arm yourself, you need to double back through the areas you've already traversed, and this time you need to stab the wandering dino dudes in the face. Once you've slain all the Dino Men, a portal opens up near the beginning of the stage, taking you on to the next level. From here, stage designs grow more complex, consisting of multiple segments that often need to be traversed more than once. Most stages involve activating portals with switches, and there's a lot of back and forth movement throughout a level. There's a nice touch: once you defeat an enemy, it stays defeated when you backtrack through its stomping grounds, at least until you die, at which point the enemies respawn. Many levels involve scrolling in multiple directions, and verticality factors in here enough that you can scroll the screen up or down to scope what lies out of view. You even have the ability to snipe foes that are a pretty decent distance out of visual range. As you play, Turok acquires a ridiculous number of weapons. First, there's a bow and arrow, then a handgun, then a shotgun, then a minigun, a grenade launcher, and more. It's a bit of overkill considering how brief the game ultimately is. A skilled player can probably see most of the 8 stages here in a couple of hours. But the advanced weapons do have their uses. The shotgun can take out low-crawling monsters, and the grenade launcher can break certain destructible walls. It's not exactly rocket science, but it does the trick. The levels here are fairly tiny, all things considered, which means their multi-directional movement avoids one of the core tenets of Eurojig, the endlessly meandering stage designs. Turok 2 is small and focused enough that you never feel like you're wandering around aimlessly or stumbling into useless spaces that only exist to waste your time. Despite the non-linear nature of each individual stage, Turok 2 minimizes fruitless quote-unquote exploration. In a lot of ways, the game feels more akin to early NES exploratory titles like Rygar or Rambo. Rough, a bit opaque, but ultimately pretty manageable, and sometimes even thoughtfully designed, at least when it sticks to platforming. One of Turok 2's biggest shortcomings is that it wants to incorporate the flexibility of a 3D game within the restrictions of a 2D game, which means it keeps shifting modes. Even the simplistic first stage goes from Double Dragon-esque forced perspective game to side-scrolling platformer and back again. Later levels take this even further. There are forced scrolling sections where you run and leap over pits while riding a dinosaur. There are shoot-'em-up sequences where you ride a pteranodon while dodging fire from gun emplacements. There are even 3D-like sequences where you scroll into the screen while river rafting. And there are also sequences like the part where you run toward the screen, Crash Bandicoot style, dodging stumbling blocks you can't see until it's too late, and trying not to be consumed by a giant worm. Obtrusive as these scenes can be, they really wouldn't be too bad if not for the fact that Turok 2 has some of the most hostile checkpointing imaginable. The game's levels are multi-part affairs, and they usually contain only a single mid-stage checkpoint, if that. Anytime you die, you're forced to return way back to the beginning of the stage, unless you've made it pretty far into the level. In that case, you get to start from a checkpoint. That sounds great, sure, but the checkpoints typically come after a mode change sequence. That means you frequently need to complete a few tasks to unlock the novelty segment, master that on the spur of the moment, and then save your progress. It's oddly punitive. Additional frustrations come in the game's weirdly inconsistent physics. Jumping, in particular, involves a lot of guesswork, and environments don't always behave the way you'd expect. Sometimes Turok can grab a ledge and pull himself up, Lara Croft style. Sometimes he can't. Sometimes you jump at a wall and come to a dead stop. Other times you inexplicably sail through the wall to die in a bottomless pit. There are just a few of these little flaws and nuisances in Turok 2, but collectively they add up to drag down a game that overall plays pretty well. The levels require some exploration and effort, but they never feel too large or unstructured. Turok commands a huge arsenal and can fire in 5 directions, with a variety of pickups to collect, including a shield that works just like in a Doom-inspired FPS. It cuts physical damage in half by absorbing 50% of it. Bit managers really put a lot of thought into how this game works. This could have been a callow left-to-right action game, or a formless blob of a platformer. Instead, it tries pretty hard to be good and turns out decent, albeit flawed. But honestly, that's a lot more than you'd expect from a licensed, portable tie-in to a genre that was wildly inappropriate for a 90s vintage handheld. Maybe it's a low bar to clear, but at least Turok 2 made the effort. Next time on Game Boy Works Color, dost thou desire the power?